At the turn of the 20th century, America was a land of hope and fear. Millions of immigrants arrived in New York carrying dreams, traditions, and old-world conflicts. Among them came men from southern Italy and Sicily, bringing with them a secret criminal culture that would soon take root in American soil. These immigrants settled in tight neighborhoods like Little Italy, where the law felt distant and survival depended on loyalty. In these streets, whispers of power, fear, and protection began to spread, quietly, invisibly. From this environment emerged the Black Hand. Not a single organization, but a method of terror. Criminals sent anonymous letters marked with black symbols, hands, daggers, skulls. The message was simple: pay or die. Victims were shop owners, bakers, tailors, honest men who feared the police as much as the criminals. Bombings, kidnappings, and murders followed those who refused to obey. At the center of this shadow world stood Giuseppe Morello, a calm, intelligent, and ruthless man. Known as the Clutch Hand, he would become the first true mafia boss of New York City. Morello understood something crucial. Chaos brings attention, but structure brings power. Under his leadership, crime began to evolve, from scattered extortion to organized, disciplined control. The American Mafia had been born. By the year 1900, New York City was expanding faster than its laws could control. Entire neighborhoods operated in isolation, separated by language, poverty, and mistrust of authorities. In Italian immigrant districts, many residents avoided the police, not out of guilt, but out of fear. Reporting crime could lead to social exile, or worse. Criminal groups recognized this weakness. They observed quietly, identifying shop owners without protection, families with savings, and men who stood alone. Power did not arrive through open violence. It arrived through familiarity. Criminals became neighbors, helpers, and protectors. Over time, fear blended into daily routine. This environment did not create chaos. It created opportunity. The mafia was not imposed on these communities. It slowly grew from within them, feeding on silence and necessity. The primary weapon of these early criminal groups was not the gun or the knife. It was the letter. Known as the Black Hand threat, these messages were written anonymously and delivered quietly. They demanded money and obedience, often decorated with crude symbols: a black hand, a dagger, a coffin. The message was clear and deeply personal. The writers knew the victim's name, business, family, and daily habits. Violence was promised, not explained. Many victims never saw their attackers, only the consequences faced by those who refused to comply. Explosions, kidnappings, and beatings became warnings to others. Fear spread faster than blood. The brilliance of the system lay in its efficiency. A single act of violence could control dozens of people. Terror became organized, predictable, and sustainable. What made this era different from earlier street crime was structure. Roles were clearly defined. One group gathered intelligence, another delivered messages. Enforcers acted only when necessary. This separation reduced risk and increased control. Victims rarely knew who truly stood behind the threats. The system protected its leaders by keeping them distant from violence. These criminal networks began to resemble businesses rather than gangs. Decisions were calculated. Risks were minimized. Profits were reinvested. Loyalty was enforced through fear and reward. For the first time, criminal activity followed internal rules. This was the moment when crime stopped being spontaneous and became strategic. The mafia was no longer a reaction to poverty. It was an organization designed to exploit it. At the center of this evolving system stood Giuseppe Morello. Unlike impulsive criminals, Morello believed in patience. He avoided unnecessary violence and discouraged chaos. His authority came from organization, not fear alone. Under his leadership, decisions flowed through trusted intermediaries, creating layers of protection. Morello demanded absolute loyalty and punished betrayal severely. He understood that power in America required invisibility. His name rarely appeared in police reports, yet his influence spread across neighborhoods. Morello represented a new type of criminal leader, one who thought long-term. He was not building a gang. He was building a system. Morello's most dangerous move was shifting operations toward counterfeiting. Fake currency flooded New York, passing through shops, markets, and banks unnoticed. This crime carried enormous risk but promised massive reward. Unlike extortion, counterfeiting attacked the foundation of national trust. It forced federal authorities to intervene. For the Mafia, this was a calculated gamble. The profits funded expansion, bribery, and protection. The operation required secrecy, discipline, and technical skill, qualities that the organization now possessed. This marked a critical transition. The Mafia was no longer exploiting individuals. It was challenging institutions. Counterfeiting created a trail that fear could not erase. Paper, ink, equipment, and money moving in patterns. Federal agents and city detectives began watching print shops, scanning banks for repeated serial numbers, and questioning merchants who unknowingly accepted fake bills. In the Italian neighborhoods, rumors spread faster than facts. Someone was talking. Someone was being followed. Morello's people reacted by tightening discipline. Meetings became smaller. Messages traveled through trusted relatives. And suddenly the streets felt different. Quieter, more suspicious. For the first time, the organization's greatest weakness was not a rival gang, but visibility. The Mafia had built a system to control its community. Now that same community, under pressure, could become a source of exposure. The investigation struck where Morello least expected, at the edges, among men who wanted safety more than loyalty. One arrest led to another. Small-time couriers, nervous printers, and middlemen, people who thought they were untouchable, suddenly faced prison. Under interrogation, some broke, not with dramatic confessions, but with tiny details. A name, a room, a location, a schedule. Authorities learned how the machine worked piece by piece. The Mafia's protection depended on silence, but silence was fragile when families were threatened with deportation or long sentences. Morello's empire didn't collapse overnight. It began to crack the way a bridge cracks, quietly, invisibly, until one day it cannot hold the weight. As pressure increased, the Mafia adapted in a way that defined its future. It started looking legitimate. Money moved into respectable fronts. Groceries, import businesses, small real estate deals, places where cash could hide in plain sight. This wasn't just camouflage. It was strategy. A criminal who owns a storefront becomes harder to remove than a criminal who stands on a corner. At the same time, the organization began recruiting men with patience and manners, people who could negotiate, bribe, and influence without raising alarms. By the end of this phase, the Mafia was transforming from a visible street terror into a quieter, more durable power. The violence did not vanish. It simply became the last resort, not the first move. The counterfeiting investigations eventually reached their inevitable conclusion. Evidence accumulated slowly but relentlessly. Printing equipment, financial records, witness testimonies. When arrests finally came, they were precise and coordinated. This was not a chaotic police raid, but a calculated strike aimed at leadership. For the first time, an American court prepared to judge crimes that had been designed to remain invisible. The courtroom became a new battlefield. Here, silence was no longer protection, and reputation offered no shield. The Mafia faced something it could not intimidate: legal procedure. This moment marked a shift in power. Crime was no longer just fought in the streets, it was challenged in institutions built to endure. The trials exposed something deeper than individual crimes. Prosecutors demonstrated patterns, repeated methods, shared profits, coordinated decisions. What the public saw was not a gang, but a system. Newspapers followed every development, translating legal language into fear and fascination. For immigrant communities, reactions were divided. Some felt relief, believing the terror might finally end. Others feared retaliation or collapse of fragile local order. Inside the criminal world, the message was clear: visibility was dangerous. Leaders began withdrawing from direct involvement, delegating authority downward. This was not defeat. It was evolution. The Mafia learned that survival in America required distance from crime scenes and closeness to influence. As older figures were imprisoned or weakened, a generational shift quietly began. Younger members watched carefully, absorbing lessons from these failures. They learned that excessive violence attracted attention, that centralized operations were vulnerable, and that adaptability was essential. New leaders favored patience over intimidation, alliances over threats. They focused on stability, not spectacle. This transition did not end crime. It refined it. By the mid-1910s, the American Mafia was no longer an imported tradition struggling to survive. It had become something new, a distinctly American criminal structure, shaped by courts, capitalism, and modern cities. The foundation for the future had been laid, quietly, deliberately, and permanently. By the mid-1910s, open terror was no longer the primary tool of control. The Mafia had learned that fear worked best when it was subtle. Instead of threats, there were warnings. Instead of explosions, there were accidents. Violence became rare but decisive, designed to send messages without drawing headlines. Within neighborhoods, disputes were increasingly settled quietly, behind closed doors. This period marked a psychological shift. Criminals no longer needed to prove their power publicly. Everyone already knew who held it. The absence of noise became a sign of dominance. Silence itself turned into authority, and that silence spread across streets, businesses, and families. Inside the organization, rules hardened into tradition. Loyalty was no longer based only on fear, but on obligation. Family ties, marriages, and shared financial interests bound members together. Breaking trust meant isolation, not just punishment. This internal discipline reduced the need for constant enforcement. Leaders focused on maintaining balance, resolving conflicts before they escalated, redistributing profits to prevent resentment, and keeping younger members under control. What emerged was not chaos, but order, an illegal order, hidden beneath the surface of American society. The Mafia had begun to resemble a shadow institution, operating parallel to the law, but governed by its own code. At the same time, the wider American public remained largely unaware of the depth of this transformation. To outsiders, crime appeared to be declining. Fewer explosions, fewer arrests, fewer sensational headlines. This illusion of calm worked in the Mafia's favor. While authorities focused on visible threats, criminal networks strengthened quietly. Influence replaced intimidation. Bribes replaced threats. By mastering restraint, the Mafia ensured survival. By 1916, it was no longer fighting to exist. It was positioning itself for the future, waiting for the next economic and social shift that would open new opportunities. The groundwork was complete. All that remained was time. When the United States entered the years leading to World War I, daily life began to change. Even far from the battlefield, ports became busier, factories louder, and money moved faster. For criminal organizations, this shift created new openings. Increased shipping meant increased theft. Wartime demand meant shortages, and shortages meant profit. The Mafia adapted quickly, embedding itself into supply chains and labor disputes. It did not control industries yet, but it learned how they worked. This period taught the organization a critical lesson. Major historical events always create cracks in the system, and those who understand the system can slip through unnoticed. World War I also reshaped immigration. Travel became harder, borders tightened. Fewer newcomers arrived from Italy, and those already in America became more rooted. This slowed the flow of old-world criminals, but strengthened local networks. The Mafia began relying less on foreign connections and more on American-born members who understood the country, the language, and its laws. This subtle change mattered deeply. The organization was no longer just an imported tradition. It was becoming native. By the late 1910s, loyalty was no longer to Sicily alone, but to American territory. This marked the true transformation. The Mafia was no longer foreign. It was American. At the street level, younger members refined what their predecessors had started. They avoided unnecessary exposure. They dressed respectably. They learned how to speak to bankers, lawyers, and politicians without raising suspicion. Crime blended into business. Illegal profits moved through legitimate channels. This generation believed in patience. They were not chasing fear, they were building permanence. By observing the mistakes of early leaders, they learned how to survive long-term. What had once been a fragile underground network was now resilient. Even when individuals were arrested, the structure remained intact. This was no longer an experiment. It was an institution in the making. By 1919, the era of birth was complete. The Mafia had survived fear, police pressure, courts, and internal collapse. It had learned when to fight, when to disappear, and when to wait. Most importantly, it had learned America, its cities, its weaknesses, its opportunities. The violence of the Black Hand era was fading, replaced by something quieter and far more dangerous. The foundation was solid. The rules were written. The next chapter would not be about survival, but expansion. The American Mafia stood ready, shaped by 2 decades of adaptation, discipline, and silence. One of the strangest realities of early American Mafia life was how crime disguised itself as morality. In many Italian neighborhoods, criminals actively discouraged random theft, drunken violence, and public disorder. A man who robbed without permission could be punished more harshly than someone who extorted with approval. Why? Because chaos attracted police. Order attracted trust. This inversion confused outsiders but stabilized the streets. To many residents, the Mafia felt less dangerous than unpredictability. This moral illusion was powerful. People feared criminals, but relied on them. That contradiction allowed organized crime to root itself emotionally, not just financially. Another rarely documented tactic was controlled failure. Leaders sometimes allowed small operations to be exposed intentionally. A minor arrest or raid would convince police they had solved the problem. Meanwhile, larger structures remained untouched. This sacrificial logic was cold but effective. It shaped how the Mafia viewed people, not as individuals, but as roles. Loyalty did not mean protection from consequences. It meant acceptance of purpose. This mindset hardened the organization psychologically. It also distanced leadership from guilt. Survival was framed as necessity, not cruelty. Fear inside the Mafia was as carefully engineered as fear outside it. Members were rarely punished immediately. Instead, uncertainty was used. A man who made a mistake might be ignored for weeks. No threats. No warnings. Just silence. This delay destroyed confidence far more effectively than violence. People imagined consequences worse than reality. When punishment finally came, it felt inevitable. This psychological discipline reduced rebellion and prevented impulsive behavior. By mastering anticipation, the Mafia controlled minds before controlling bodies. This internal fear culture is one of the least visible but most effective tools the organization developed before 1920. The Mafia also learned to exploit American optimism. Many crimes succeeded because victims believed things would work out. Extortion payments were framed as temporary, debts as flexible, threats as symbolic. Criminals spoke calmly, politely, even kindly. This emotional contrast lowered defenses. Victims often complied not because they panicked, but because they hoped cooperation would end the problem. It never did. This manipulation of hope, not fear, proved devastatingly effective. It demonstrated a deep understanding of American psychology, something European criminal groups had never mastered before. Perhaps the most unsettling truth is this. By 1919, the Mafia did not see itself as criminal. It saw itself as inevitable. Leaders spoke about balance, order, and continuity. Crime was reframed as management, violence as correction, extortion as taxation. This self-justification removed hesitation. Once an organization believes it is necessary, not optional, it becomes extremely difficult to destroy. The American Mafia did not emerge from brutality alone. It emerged from belief. And belief, once established, survives arrests, prisons, and time. In the early years, firearms were not the mafia's preferred tool. Guns were loud, expensive, and attracted witnesses. Instead, early American mafiosi relied on weapons that blended into everyday life. Knives, razors, ice picks, and blunt objects were common because they were legal, accessible, and disposable. A knife could be carried without suspicion. A razor could be explained as a barber's tool. These weapons allowed violence to remain personal and quiet. Murders often occurred indoors, in hallways, stairwells, or back rooms, places where sound died quickly. This choice shaped mafia behavior. Violence was intimate, controlled, and deliberate, reinforcing fear through closeness rather than spectacle. When guns were used, they were chosen carefully. Cheap revolvers and small-caliber pistols dominated, not for power, but for concealment. Accuracy mattered less than proximity. Shootings were rarely random. The shooter stood close, often face to face. This was intentional. Eye contact amplified terror, spreading fear beyond the victim to everyone who heard the story later. Ammunition was limited, so shots were few. One bullet was often enough. Excessive firing was considered reckless. Every gunshot was a risk, and risk was something the mafia learned to avoid early. Firearms were tools of finality, not chaos. Weapon choice also reflected hierarchy. Lower-level enforcers carried blades or improvised weapons. Trusted men carried guns. This distinction mattered. A firearm symbolized authority and responsibility. Losing it, or using it improperly, could end a career or a life. Leaders almost never carried weapons themselves. They delegated violence downward, maintaining distance from bloodshed. This separation protected them legally and psychologically. The man who ordered violence did not feel it the way the man who committed it did. This hierarchy of weapons reinforced hierarchy of power. Violence was not democratic, it was assigned. Assassinations during this era were designed to look accidental. Victims fell downstairs, were struck during arguments, were found with injuries that confused investigators. Guns made deaths obvious. Blades created ambiguity. This ambiguity slowed investigations and protected networks. Police struggled to prove intent. Witnesses disappeared into silence. The mafia understood something crucial. The best crime is the one that creates doubt. Weapons were selected not only to kill, but to confuse. This philosophy would define organized crime tactics for decades. By 1919, the mafia's relationship with weapons was fully developed. Violence was no longer emotional, it was procedural. Weapons were chosen based on environment, witnesses, and aftermath. The goal was not dominance through force, but control through inevitability. People complied not because they saw guns, but because they knew someone else had. The true power of mafia weapons was psychological. The threat lingered even when the weapon was absent. This invisible presence of violence became the organization's most enduring weapon of all. In Sicily, murder was a message meant to be understood. Killings were often public, symbolic, and unmistakable. The goal was not concealment, but clarity. Bodies were left where they could be seen, sometimes posed, sometimes mutilated. The community was meant to interpret the act without explanation. This tradition followed immigrants to America, but it did not survive intact. In U.S. cities, public violence brought police, newspapers, and courts. The old Sicilian logic clashed with American reality. What worked in a rural village failed in a modern metropolis. The lesson was brutal but clear. Symbolism had to be replaced by discretion. In America, the most effective murder was the one no one could explain. Victims vanished. A man left home and never returned. Another fell during a private dispute. The body, if found, told no story. This was not weakness, it was intelligence. American mafiosi learned that mystery paralyzed investigations. Without witnesses, police chased rumors instead of suspects. This method required patience and planning. Locations were chosen carefully. Basements, back rooms, stairwells. Timing mattered. Noise mattered. The killing itself was brief. The aftermath was endless confusion. This was a complete break from Sicilian tradition. and the birth of a uniquely American style of organized murder. Another defining method of the era was extreme proximity. Killers stood close, very close. This was not accidental. Close-range attacks reduced error, limited noise, and increased certainty. Knives, short-barreled pistols, and blunt force were preferred. There was no chase, no spectacle. The victim often realized what was happening only seconds before death. This intimacy served a psychological purpose. Survivors described these killings as cold rather than violent. That coldness spread fear deeper than brutality ever could. It told others this was planned, calm, and unavoidable. Some killings were not immediate. Victims were beaten, stabbed, or injured in ways that led to death hours or days later. This delayed responsibility. Doctors, accidents, or infections took the blame. The Mafia understood that timing could be weaponized. A man dying later created doubt. Doubt weakened prosecutions. This method also sent a deeper message. Punishment was not just death, it was suffering, uncertainty, and fear. Unlike Sicily, where death was instant and public, American Mafia violence stretched across time. It lingered. For Italian immigrants, the church was more than a place of worship. It was protection, identity, and emotional survival in a foreign land. Criminal groups understood this immediately. Violence stopped at church doors. Conflicts were paused during religious holidays. This was not respect, it was strategy. Police avoided churches. Investigators hesitated to interfere with religious life. By aligning themselves with faith, mafiosi wrapped their actions in moral insulation. A man seen praying publicly appeared trustworthy, even righteous. This created an emotional contradiction that confused outsiders. Criminals were not rejecting God. They were hiding behind him. Faith became a shield, not against sin, but against scrutiny. Church spaces became unofficial neutral zones. Meetings that would have been dangerous elsewhere could happen safely near or around religious institutions. Conversations took place after Mass, during processions, or at charity events. No threats were spoken, no deals written, only understanding. The presence of religion lowered suspicion and softened perception. Even rival figures avoided violence in these spaces, not out of holiness, but out of calculation. Blood near a church drew outrage, not fear. The Mafia learned early that some places were too visible to corrupt directly. Instead of controlling the church, they learned to orbit it. Influence without ownership. Proximity without responsibility. One of the most disturbing intersections of religion and crime was confession. Some criminals confessed sins knowing there would be no earthly consequences. This created psychological release without accountability. Guilt was processed spiritually, not legally. The Mafia did not require religious approval, but it benefited from religious forgiveness. This separation allowed men to commit violence without emotional collapse. Faith became a private space where conscience was managed, not erased, but controlled. This internal balance reduced impulsive behavior and strengthened discipline. A man who believes he can be forgiven is less likely to break under pressure. Mafiosi often donated openly to churches and community charities. These acts were not generosity, they were investment. Public morality protected private crime. A respected donor was harder to accuse. A familiar face at church was harder to suspect. This dual identity fractured perception. Communities struggled to reconcile kindness with cruelty. That confusion worked in the Mafia's favor. It slowed judgment. It delayed action. By presenting themselves as moral participants in society, criminals blurred the boundary between legality and legitimacy. This was not hypocrisy. It was camouflage. At the beginning of the 20th century, one fear was stronger than prison: deportation. Many Italian immigrants lived without full legal protection. A single accusation could mean being sent back to poverty or to enemies waiting in Sicily. The Mafia understood this perfectly. Threats did not need to mention death. They mentioned paperwork, immigration officers, questions about identity. A man could be destroyed without violence, simply by being reported. This fear made silence automatic. Witnesses disappeared not because they were threatened, but because survival depended on invisibility. The Mafia did not control immigration law, but it controlled the terror surrounding it. This gave criminal groups enormous leverage over entire families, not just individuals. Crowded tenement buildings became perfect environments for Mafia influence. Thin walls meant secrets traveled easily. Everyone knew who came home late, who argued, who hid money. Criminal groups used this density to monitor behavior without effort. Rent collectors, building caretakers, and neighbors all became sources of information. If someone resisted, pressure followed quietly. Complaints to landlords, lost housing, sudden inspections. Losing an apartment meant losing stability, community, and reputation. Violence was rarely needed. Control of living space created control of life. The Mafia did not own most buildings, but it controlled how safe it felt to live inside them. Disease was a constant presence in immigrant neighborhoods. Tuberculosis, infections, workplace injuries. Medical care was limited and expensive. The Mafia stepped into this gap indirectly. It arranged doctors, paid hospital fees, transported the sick quietly. This created deep, personal loyalty. A man whose child survived because help arrived remembered that forever. No threats were required afterward. Gratitude became obligation. This system blurred the line between criminal and protector. The Mafia did not heal people, but it controlled access to survival. That control lasted longer than fear ever could. At the beginning of the century, most robberies were not dramatic street crimes. They were slow, intimate operations inside tenement buildings. Many shop owners slept where they worked. Safes were small, often hidden behind walls or under floors. Mafia crews learned building layouts by observing deliveries, repairs, and renovations. Sometimes they waited weeks. When the moment came, the robbery happened at night without breaking doors. A wall was opened quietly from the next apartment. The victim woke up to an empty safe and no sign of forced entry. Police had nothing to investigate, no noise, no witnesses. These early robberies taught the Mafia a core rule: the best theft leaves no story. Ice wagons were essential before refrigeration. They delivered daily to homes, shops, and restaurants. Criminal groups noticed something important. Ice deliveries revealed routines: who was home, who wasn't, where cash was kept. Mafia members posed as helpers or drivers, sometimes replacing real workers for a single day. During delivery, doors were opened willingly. Safes were visible. Trust was automatic. In some cases, money disappeared without victims realizing it until hours later. No violence, no panic, just absence. This method exploited infrastructure, not force. It was theft disguised as labor, and it worked repeatedly. Some of the most delicate robberies targeted churches, not the altar, but the donation flow. Large religious events generated significant cash before banking was common. Money was stored temporarily in back rooms or priests' residences. Mafia crews avoided breaking in. Instead, trusted insiders were used: janitors, maintenance workers, or relatives of church staff. The thefts were small enough to avoid scandal, but frequent enough to matter. Victims often chose silence to protect the church's reputation. This created a perfect crime. No report, no investigation, no consequences. The Mafia learned that moral institutions feared exposure more than theft. Factories paid workers in cash. Payrolls were predictable and vulnerable. Mafia groups studied routes, timing, and habits. Robberies happened minutes before money reached the workplace, often without guns. A confrontation in a stairwell, a brief struggle, a bag taken. The victim survived, but the message spread. Employers quietly adjusted routes or paid protection. These robberies were not about money alone. They were negotiations by force. Once a payroll was hit, future payments became leverage. The Mafia discovered that repeated small robberies created long-term control. Jewelry robberies were rarely smash and grab. Mafia crews preferred trust. One man posed as a customer, another as a partner. Visits happened over weeks. When trust was established, jewels were handled openly. One moment of distraction was enough. A ring pocketed, a tray switched. Losses discovered later. Police were reluctant to believe professionals could be fooled so easily. Shame silenced victims. This method required patience and social skill, not brutality. It marked the mafia's transition from force to finesse. Not all early mafia power came from Sicily. In Brooklyn, the Navy Street Gang represented a uniquely American evolution of organized crime. Led by Paul Kelly, a former boxer, the gang combined physical intimidation with political influence. Kelly understood something new. Power in America required connections beyond the streets. The Navy Street Gang controlled docks, labor unions, and gambling operations. Violence was calculated, not emotional. Fighters were trained, disciplined, and loyal. Kelly recruited men who could follow orders and avoid unnecessary exposure. This gang blurred the line between ethnic mafia groups and broader American criminal organizations. What made the Navy Street Gang historically important was its integration into politics. Bribes, protection deals, and election interference gave the gang legitimacy and protection. This model would later influence Italian mafia families. It proved that organized crime could survive not just through fear, but through influence. By the mid-1910s, this approach was redefining how mafia power functioned in the United States. Unlike the Sicilian mafia, the Camorra came from Naples. Its structure was looser, more violent, and more impulsive. In New York, Camorra groups controlled gambling, extortion, and street enforcement. Leadership was unstable. Power shifted frequently through violence. Morano and Valero represented competing factions. Their rivalry eventually erupted into the infamous Mafia-Camorra conflict. Murders became public. Attention intensified. Unlike Sicilian leaders, Camorra bosses failed to adapt to American conditions. Their reliance on visible violence proved disastrous. By 1917, Camorra power collapsed under police pressure and internal betrayal. This failure taught the Sicilian mafia a critical lesson: America punishes chaos. Adaptation, not tradition, determines survival. The fall of the Camorra cleared the path for a more disciplined mafia to dominate. By the end of the 1910s, surviving Sicilian groups began forming quiet alliances. No official families yet, only understandings. Violence decreased, communication improved, territories were respected. This coalition phase marked the final step in mafia birth. There were no public leaders, no declarations. Power was shared carefully. Mistakes of the past guided every decision. These men had learned America. They knew the next era would reward patience, not blood. When 1919 arrived, the mafia was no longer forming. It was ready. In the early 1900s, food businesses were among the safest places for criminals. Grocery stores, bakeries, butcher shops, and small restaurants were everywhere in Italian neighborhoods. They required cash, constant deliveries, and daily human interaction. To police, they looked harmless. To the mafia, they were perfect cover. A man standing behind a counter did not look dangerous. A back room filled with sacks of flour did not attract suspicion. Yet these spaces hid meetings, stored money, and sometimes weapons. Food also created routine. Deliveries arrived at the same hour every day. Customers came and went predictably. This allowed criminals to observe the neighborhood without appearing to watch it. A butcher knew who was home. A baker knew who had money. A grocer knew who was struggling. Information flowed naturally. No spying required. Meals themselves became moments of negotiation. Disputes were discussed over bread and wine. Silence during a shared meal carried meaning. Refusing food was an insult. Accepting it implied trust. Violence almost never happened at the table. Eating together created a pause in conflict, a space where decisions were delayed and emotions cooled. The mafia understood something ancient. People are most vulnerable when they are fed. By 1910, many mafia figures preferred food businesses not for profit, but for protection. If police entered, they found nothing but commerce. The kitchen absorbed secrets the street could not. Food was not comfort. It was camouflage. Hunger shaped everything in immigrant life. Many families lived one missed paycheck away from starvation. The mafia did not cause this hunger, but it learned how to use it. Food loans replaced money loans. A sack of flour today created obligation tomorrow. A free meal during hard times was never free. Gratitude turned into loyalty. Loyalty turned into silence. Communal meals reinforced hierarchy. Leaders ate first. Younger men waited. Portions mattered. Seating mattered. Who served the food mattered. These details trained obedience without orders. No speech was needed. Everyone understood their place by where they sat and what they received. This discipline at the table mirrored discipline in the street. Food was also used as punishment. A man who disobeyed was not beaten immediately. He was excluded. No invitation, no shared meal. In tight communities, this isolation was devastating. Hunger was social as much as physical. To eat alone was to be marked as unreliable. Certain foods carried meaning. Simple meals signaled restraint and seriousness. Excess signaled recklessness. Leaders avoided indulgence. Control over appetite symbolized control over self. This was not cultural coincidence. It was training. A man who could not control hunger could not be trusted with power. By 1919, food rituals were deeply embedded in mafia life. Kitchens replaced offices. Tables replaced desks. Decisions that shaped neighborhoods were made while eating quietly. The mafia did not celebrate with food. It ruled with it. For early mafia members, prison was not a collapse of power. It was a pause. In the first decades of the 20th century, American prisons were overcrowded, poorly organized, and deeply divided by ethnicity. Italian inmates were often grouped together, by accident or convenience, and this created something unexpected: concentration. Men who would never meet on the streets now shared cells, meals, and silence. Inside, rank did not disappear. It sharpened. A man who had commanded outside prison still commanded inside. Younger inmates observed closely, who spoke calmly, who negotiated with guards, who avoided trouble. Prison stripped away money and territory, leaving only character and reputation. This acted as a brutal filter. Weak men broke. Reckless men attracted punishment. Controlled men survived and gained respect. Conversations happened quietly, often during work details or night hours. Stories were exchanged, mistakes analyzed, arrests dissected. Prison became a classroom where failure was studied honestly. Men learned what tactics led to conviction and which ones left no trail. Law enforcement unknowingly provided education through incarceration. Most importantly, prison forged trust. A man who stayed silent under pressure proved his value permanently. When released, he was no longer just an associate, he was tested. By the time many early mafia figures returned to the streets, they were more disciplined, more patient, and more dangerous than before. Prison did not reform them, it refined them. Daily prison life revealed another truth. Control did not require violence. Food rations were minimal. Hunger was constant. Mafia figures learned quickly how to manipulate this system. Stronger inmates protected weaker ones in exchange for loyalty. Food was shared selectively. A piece of bread could buy silence. A warm meal could buy obedience. Work assignments mattered. Kitchen jobs, laundry, maintenance. These positions allowed movement, communication, and access. Mafia inmates sought these roles not for comfort, but for influence. A man who controlled small privileges controlled people. Guards, often underpaid and overwhelmed, were easier to negotiate with than expected. Respectful behavior mattered more than threats. The mafia learned how authority really worked in America, not through fear alone, but through predictability and calm. Punishment inside prison was rarely physical. Isolation was more effective. An inmate ignored by others became invisible. No conversation, no shared food, no protection. This mirrored street tactics perfectly. Prison reinforced mafia discipline because the environment rewarded restraint and punished impulsiveness. By the late 1910s, prison was no longer feared by mafia members in the same way it was feared by ordinary criminals. It had become part of the life cycle. Arrest, silence, observation, release, advancement. This cycle strengthened the organization rather than weakening it. When men walked free, they carried prison discipline with them into the streets. The mafia that emerged from prison was quieter, colder, and far more organized than the one that entered. By the final years of the 1910s, something subtle had changed in American cities. Violence had not disappeared, crime had not ended, but the noise was gone. There were fewer headlines, fewer public scandals, fewer questions. People learned the boundaries of survival. Shopkeepers closed earlier. Neighbors spoke less. Children were taught which streets to avoid and which names not to repeat. This was not fear in its raw form. It was adaptation. The mafia no longer needed to announce itself. Its presence was understood. Men who once hid now blended in perfectly, standing in doorways, attending weddings, walking children to school. Nothing about them looked dangerous. That was the point. Power had learned to wear the face of normal life. Police still made arrests, but rarely the right ones. Courts still held trials, but rarely the important ones. The system functioned, yet something moved beneath it, untouched. This was not conquest. It was coexistence. America did not fall to the mafia, it made room for it. The men who survived this era were not the loudest or the strongest. They were the quietest. They learned when to step back, when to disappear, when to let others fail first. They watched laws change. They watched industries rise. They watched society argue with itself. And they waited. By 1919, these men no longer thought of themselves as criminals in the old sense. They were managers of risk, architects of patience. They had learned America the hard way, through courts, prisons, streets, kitchens, and churches. Every mistake of the early years had been absorbed into discipline. They did not celebrate survival. They did not mark victories. Survival itself was the reward. The mafia that emerged from this period had no illusions left. It trusted only structure, silence, and time. Whatever the future brought, it would not arrive unannounced. They would see it coming. When 1919 ended, nothing dramatic happened. No final battle, no collapse, no victory parade. And that was the truest sign of success. The mafia had completed its most difficult task. It had been born without being destroyed. What came next would be louder, richer, more violent, and far more visible. But all of that rested on foundations laid quietly between 1900 and 1919, years of hunger, mistakes, restraint, and learning. Those years taught the mafia how to survive America before trying to control any part of it. This story does not end with power. It ends with readiness. The readiness to expand. The readiness to adapt again. The readiness to disappear if necessary. The American Mafia did not begin with ambition. It began with silence. And silence, once mastered, never truly fades. By the end of 1919, America stood on the edge of change. New laws, new markets, new tensions. To most people, the future looked uncertain. To the Mafia, uncertainty was familiar territory. It had been shaped by uncertainty from the beginning. The organization that emerged from these early years was not large, rich, or publicly feared, but it was aligned with the structure of American life. It understood cities, institutions, human weakness, and, above all, time. It knew how to wait. And anything that knows how to wait can survive almost anything. This is where the story of beginnings truly ends. Not with action, not with noise, but with readiness. The Mafia did not rush toward the future. It allowed the future to arrive.